Okay, so recording has started. As I said, this is Nalini Elkins with Industry Network Technology Council, and you will be getting the presentations and the slides after this session is over. So yeah, please go ahead and let me know if there's anything, if you have problems with the audio, problems seeing the screens or anything like that. I'll be able to see the questions in the question window. We will also have time for questions at the end. So, I mean, please go ahead and feel free to go ahead and send in the questions, but I probably won't get to them until the end. So, what are we doing here? We have a collaborative project, and this is in coordination with the Industry Network Technology Council and the India Internet Engineering Society. And I encourage any of you in the India region to go to the IIESoc website and sign up and become a member. It's free and attend their events. They do great events. And of course, the same for INTC. INTC is global. Anyone can participate and join, and it's free, and we want everyone. So it's techies. We're both of us we're techies who work with other techies on techie issues. So if that's you, then come join us. So this particular set of classes is a grant from ISIF Asia, which is a part of the APNIC Foundation. Thank you so much. And the point is to provide IPv6 training, and in particular with a view to IPv6 deployment at brick and mortar industry. As you guys might be well aware, this is an area which has lagged, and that as I said, it causes a lot of issues for the internet as a whole. And don't get me wrong, I totally understand why people have not converted, and it's a lot of work. I totally get that, but we want to go ahead and help with that whole process. Our vision is that we'll provide training on IPv6 all for free, and we will also help with doing an analysis of security and application conversion, in particular as it affects enterprises. And at the very end of this, I will have a link for the call for participation for universities and also for enterprises to join it. And then the last step, which we hope to start taking on with next year, is to start helping you actually go ahead and plan your deployment. So these are all the classes that we will be providing. The ones all the way through the IPv6 security one in July are from the ISIF grant, and the next ones are from a generous grant from ARIN. The call for participation is affiliated with the ARIN region. What we're doing is the first Thursday of the month, we will do some theory. For example, today we're going to go ahead and talk about IPv6 and addressing and so forth. And then the Thursday after that, we will do a lab. We'll do hands-on stuff, and you don't have to have anything, on your end to participate. You can just look, but we will also give you, if appropriate, apps you might want to download on your phone, or certain things that you might want to do, commands and whatever on your laptop, of course, all for free. That might be helpful to you in following along. So let's go ahead and get started. And without too much ado, I'll leave this in the presentation for you. Just a couple of words about who I am. I'm the president of Industry Network Technology Council. founder and CEO of Inside Products, and also on the board of the IIESoc. I've written a couple of RFCs for IPv6, but I'm mostly a product developer, and my products have been OEM by IBM and other folks. Now, IPv6, which is why we're here, is I've worked with IPv6 for many, many years, and really, I think it's really the way to go. I mean, there's no option. There's no IPv8 coming along. We've got to do this. So, let's go ahead and start. And my focus again is large brick and mortar industry. That's been my world for the last 30 years, and God willing, for the next 30 years. So this is what we're going to talk about. And I know this is a bit of an eye chart, and like just look at it briefly and we'll talk later. We'll go through this slowly. So by the end, you're going to be like, yeah, I totally get everything. I understand all of this, but we'll just go slow. We'll go slow so you understand it. The thing about addressing is that if you learn nothing else but how IPv6 addressing works, you will be very, very far along in your IPv6 abilities. If you understand the structures, and as I said, let's go slow. Let's go slow and do ask questions. So, what is a network address? Let's start with your very first attempt at learning this. Okay, well, sure. Everybody needs to have an address. What's everybody, right? Well, actually, an interface needs to have an address. And then you might have multiple interfaces on whatever device you have, but whatever. Every interface, if you're going to talk to something outside yourself, needs to have an interface. Even if you're talking to yourself, you need the loopback. You need a loopback interface. So then let's look at addresses. So what's this? This is, of course, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Sorry to be so U.S. centric, but there's nothing to say. I think everybody knows 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, for good or bad. That's a physical address, right? That's an address. So let's talk about private versus public. So a private address, is like a P.O. box. You don't know what that is affiliated with, whereas the public address, you know perfectly well what that is affiliated with. Yeah, why am I going back down so low? Why am I doing such basic things? Well, because these concepts, of course, we know these concepts in IPv4, but how about IPv6? How do we have these very concepts of addresses per interface, public versus private? How do we have those in IPv6, and how has it changed? So let's take a look. So here's some sample IPv4 addresses. So we've got 192, 168, 1.1, whatever, 10.12, 201.23. Now, of course, you guys are probably doing the same thing I am, right? Which is you look at the first couple of octets and you go, okay, well, or even the first octet, and you go, well, that's a 10 dot address. I know a whole lot about that address just by looking at the first portion of it. Of course, the 1.1 address, you probably know a whole lot by looking at that too. But so let's analyze, what is it that we know about addresses, okay? Well, we know that this 10 dot address is a private address. And if you want to get all technical, it's a RFC 1918 address. It's routable only within a specific part. Then you can't route it over the internet. And so those are good concepts for us to think about. Same for 192, 168. The 201 address, of course, you can route over the internet. And now we don't really talk about this in the IPv4 world, but these are all global unicast addresses, and this last one in particular is global unicast and routable over the internet. So, but now let's take a look at this. These are some sample IPv6 addresses, and at this point, unless you guys have worked with IPv6 already, you can't just eyeball that first part of it. Hang on a sec, let me get my little highlighter here. You can't just say 3FFE or 2001 or FE80. You can't just look at that and say, well, I know exactly if that is a private address, if it's globally routable over the internet. I mean, what, right? But from the way I've been talking, you might think that that's probably possible. And in fact, that if you know that, again, you know an awful lot about an address. And so what we're going to do is get real familiar. So the minute you see an address, you're going to be able to say, what can it do? What is its scope? Is it routable over the internet? And so on. So let's go step by step on that. Okay. So let's start first. Let's start first with some sample private addressing. You know 192.168 very, very well, right? It's an IPv4 address and it's private. But the same thing for IPv6. If you see an address that looks like this, it starts with an FE80. Of course, it's an IPv6 address. For now, don't pay no attention to the end part of it, but just think about FE80. And you say to yourself, FE80 is a private address. It is, you know, there's some limitations to it, but it is a private address. Now, you know what? I can't answer questions and talk at the same time. Usually, I can't think, or what can I say? I can't chew gum and walk at the same time generally. But I did get a question in the chat window about why would you need a private address? Well, that's a very interesting question. Why do you need a private address in IPv4, right? Why do you need an address in IPv4? Because, for example, if you have NAT, you've got your private network inside with IPv4, and you have your external address going out to the internet. But the question really is like, but I thought with IPv6 we didn't have these kind of limitations. So why would you need a private address in IPv6? That's a very interesting question, and I'm not going to answer that for this minute. Let's dig down deeper. But suffice it to say, for quite a few reasons, even though you've got this huge address allocation, you do want to have some private addressing. Really, what a private address is an address which is not routable. Well, either definitely not on the internet, and it may not be routable outside your segment. Yeah, so that's a private address. It has a limited scope. All right. So now let's talk about public addresses. Now those are simpler, right? Those are simpler. If it's an IPv4 public address, then you know this 201.23 or whatever, you can access things over the internet with it. Same for IPv6. If you see something like this, 2001, 2860, 3FF, well, 3FFE is a special one. By and large, if you see something that looks like this, a numbered string, a numbered in the first portion of the network prefix there, a number, a decimal number. I'm gonna say a decimal, even though these are hex. If you see something like that and not something like FE80, something like that, by and large, you can think to yourself that's probably a public address. And we'll talk a little bit more about, we'll drill down more into this, but just think of that to start with. So let's talk some more about what I first started out talking with. It was about interfaces. So we are used to having an address in IPv4 per interface. And in fact, one address per interface in IPv4. So like, for example, this is the 192.168.1.100 address, and this is 101 and 102. Now, what am I doing here? I'm looking at the host portion. So you're thinking this whole part in IPv4, you've got your network, maybe you've got your subnet here, and then you've got your host. And so you're uniquely identifying these interfaces by that last address. Well, of course, you can do the same thing in IPv6. In IPv6, you are also going to split up your address into what is the network prefix, what is a subnet, and then what is known only as to the host. So we could just do this very simply. So if you've got your prefix here, this prefix happens to be 2001, 5 Charlie 0, 8 FFFF, :3. So this whole front part, my highlighter here, this whole front part, let's say, for example, let's say that maybe that's equivalent to your 192.168, something like that, and then your 100 is your host identifier. And here you've got 101 and you've got 102. And so there you are. So you've got a host identifier. You notice that I did not talk about subnets in here for IPv6. Don't worry, we will talk about those in brutal length. But I just want to kind of get some concepts into you. Is going through that. Is you've got you're breaking it down. One of the problems, I suppose, let me just say, one of the differences between IPv4 and IPv6 is that you're moving from a decimal notation to a hex notation. And I think in some ways, I have to say, just that in itself kind of makes people's eyes cross a little bit, because not only is the address a lot longer, but you've got these, these hex digits all in there. And of course, in order to make the address so much bigger, you've got to talk in hex, because decimal just isn't gonna provide enough. But still, you've got to switch your thinking a little bit. You're not thinking in decimal anymore. You're thinking in hex. But fortunately, our byte size does not change. Byte is always 8 bits. So I'm just kind of teasing there. Although they are 7-bit bytes. And anyway, forget that. Okay. So let's talk about prefix notation. I tell you, I did this thing for myself. When I first started working with IPv6, it was like, I'm telling you, I swear to God, those prefixes made my eyes cross. I'm like, what are you even talking about? And so I did this for myself so I could kind of visualize what we were talking about. Because you'll see people talking about, oh, I got a /8, or this is a /32, or a /48, whatever, something like that. So what are we really talking about? So what I've done here is, let me hang on here. So what I've done, here is the 128-bit IPv6 address. And if you're going to do a /8, what you're talking about is what is the value in these first 8 bits. And so then how does that correspond? It's going to go from anything with a 00XX to an FFXX. I mean, you know, to be honest, that's just an awful lot of real estate, isn't it? Is a /8. I mean, that's an awful lot of allocation. That's a lot of space that we're talking about. And if that particular prefix, only if you're talking about something related to the internet registry, would you ever be talking about something at that level. But a /16 or a /32, it's possible that an enterprise might deal with that. And in particular, /32. /16, of course, is this first portion, the first hex text that we've been talking about. Like, for example, one we were looking at before that we said was the private was at FE80. Now, does FE80 fall into here? Sure, it does. It's between 0000 and FFFF. And so so you're thinking to yourself, yeah, we use /16 an awful lot, don't we? The one /32 is going to go all the way across here. One of the things with a /32 is a lot of times, like whenever you go to get your address allocation, say you're going to get it from one of your internet registries, say Aaron or APNIC or RIPE or whoever. A lot of times, if you're a quite big organization, you might be getting one a /32. I will tell you, I've actually known people, very large organizations, I'm trying to remember, what was it? Something between a 22 and a 28, a /22 or 28. That was a heck of a large allocation to get. And again, now you might be asking me, like why do people want such big allocations? Well, that's a different story too. You know, if somebody's thinking down the road, I'm going to have a whole heck of a lot of IoT devices that I'm going to need to address. I may be working with sensors, something like that. Well, I may be needing myself a whole heck of a lot of IPv6 addresses. The /48, you will probably deal with that all the time. A /48 is these first three hex texts here. Generally, what is done is that you give a /48 to a particular site. Say you have a location in, I'm just going to pick stuff at random. So you have locations in New York City, you have one in San Francisco, and so forth. Then New York City would get a /48. Of course, it may be a really big location, and you may need multiple /48, but whatever, you would get a /48 for that. And then a /56. Now I'm starting to get cut stuff up a little bit finer. A /56 is right here. Is you've got that /48, you're within your site now, and then this part here between the 48 and the 64, that is what is used by convention. And now we can talk a whole lot about whether we agree with this convention or not, but that's what's used for subnetting. And when we get to the session on address planning, we can talk a whole lot about /56 and how we want to break up this whole part. Going back to our San Francisco or New York example, so you've got your /48 for San Francisco, but within there, you've got like your research department, your janitorial or whatever other department. So you want to break those up into subnets. And so you've got this portion here to break things up in. And so within the site, you're going to be using that part. And so that's when this prefix comes in real handy. The /64, again, you'll see that all the time. That's what your router interfaces are going to be. But again, by and large, there's some religious arguments
about whether you should do that or not, but I'm not getting into that. For now, let's walk before we run. Pretty much by convention, you're giving that /64 to a particular interface, router interface. At my house, I have a /64 from Comcast coming into my house. And then I've got, all my different equipment. My iPhone's got various things. My laptop has various addresses. And we will look at that. Next week in the lab, we'll go ahead and start looking at what kind of prefix you might be getting from whoever you're, if you have IPv6. If you don't, then you can see, what some of the other ones of us have. As far as allocations and stuff, and that's just how one particular ISP chose to do it. Again, we'll talk a whole lot about like what other people might have done in this area too. So to kind of recap, what we've been talking about is the address, how the structure is laid out. And so in IPv4, you've got your 4 octets, and pretty much, well, and it's broken out into 8 bits. I am not going to get into variable length, subnet masking, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, yes, sure, we all know that, and it's of course more complicated than all this. But by and large, you've got your 4 octets, and if you just say roughly, we're breaking them out this way. Similarly, for IPv6, you've got your 48 bits, and we're going to say that's your network prefix that is known for the site, and then you've got your the 16 bits, which you're going to use for your subnet, and then your 64 bits, which will be for your interface, and that interface is going to be for your host, the end device the end interface, actually, because of course you might have multiple interfaces. You may also break it out this way. You may have a different kind of structure. And where did we see this? We saw that with our FE80 addresses, where you have like the first 128 bits being this way, and then an interface ID being the rest. So this is going to be for your global unicast type addressing, and I'm going to introduce you what this kind of address is called. This and there's others like that. These kind of addresses are called link local. If you see the FE80 kind of private address, he's going to be broken out a little bit differently. So let's talk some more about address representation. So the IPv4 address is 32 bits, and the V6 address is 4 times as long. It's 128 bits. The idea there was, this is such a pain in the neck. I think maybe I'm trying to think, is it over 20 years that we've been trying to do this and hadn't happened yet completely? We don't want to do this again. We don't want to go through. So let's just leave, plenty of room so that we can, we don't have to readdress the internet all over again. And it's broken out, the IPv6 address, into 8 sections of 4 hex digits. Like I said, we've been going through this, and sort of over and over again. One of the things that you can do with IPv6 addresses is you can do what's called zero compression, because they can get really large. And so, it's like, what? Like, I don't need to repeat a whole bunch of zeros in there. So what I can do is I can just, if there's a 1 0 or multiple zeros, I can just replace that with a colon. And it is understood that when you have done that, what you have done is eliminate 1 or more strings of zeros. And we'll go over that in the next foil too. Another way addresses are represented is like this.
We just talked about prefixes. And so what you'll see is something like this. If you see this whole 128-bit address shown, but you have a /64 at the end of it. What that is telling you is that, yes, I have this whole address, but I'm really only talking about the first 64 bits of it. That's what that prefix is telling you. Or, of course, you might just see this is, you know, just the prefix alone. That's the /64. And then these two zeros, I mean, these colon, it is understood. It is understood that you've got a whole bunch of zeros there. Let's talk a tiny bit more about zero compression. It can be very, very useful to you to go ahead and compress zeros. But you can only do it once. If you did it multiple times, then you couldn't regenerate the address because you wouldn't know, did I take out 1 0 there and 3 here or 2 or what? So if you've got multiple, if strings of zeros appear more than once, you only take it out once. And so that's pretty well understood here, I think. The double colon can be, if you start getting to some of these addresses, it can start really being useful. See, for this one, I've compressed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of zeros into this colon. So I have a much shorter address. It's much easier on the eyeball, you know, because again, what you're going to be focusing on is that network prefix. And immediately you're going, okay, that's an FF00 address. Okay, that should be, you know, I should be starting to get bells ringing in my head about what that is. We haven't learned that yet, but we will. And it's much easier to see if you've got a shorter address. And if you start looking at some of these guys that are there, they start with a 0. And look at this. I was able to shrink this one all the way down to ::1. And this little guy, he's all zeros. And so I shrunk him down all the way to ::. That is a funny looking address. So let's talk now about address type. We've been talking about a little bit about public and private. We also have some other kinds of addresses, some other ways of thinking about addresses. So far, what we've been talking about is an address for one interface, and actually even one address for an interface. So those are, by and large, if you're talking about one address for an interface, or let's diverge a tiny bit. In IPv6, an interface can have multiple addresses. But still, if you're talking to it one at a time, you're talking to it unicast. You're talking to it unicast. You can also have what are called anycast addresses. For example, you could set up anycast servers. You could say, I'm going to have an anycast server, say maybe for DNS or who knows what. There's lots of interesting possibilities with anycast. I'll set one up in Paris, one in Rome, one in London, and whatever, one in New Delhi. And whichever one I get to first from my routing, that's the one I'm going to use. You notice that the anycast address looks just like a unicast address. And that's right. So you don't know from that what kind of address it is. You have to know something more before you know, is it anycast or unicast? What I will say is that in most of the work most of us do, probably it's a unicast address. You probably, if you're doing something very, very special, it may be anycast. But by and large, if you see an address like that, it's a unicast address. The other thing that there is an awful lot of in IPv6 is multicast addressing. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about multicast. Now, you know, in IPv4, we didn't use multicast nearly as much as we do in IPv6.
We use it some. There are multicast addresses for, you know, certain sets of routers and I believe MDN, multicast DNS and so forth. But it's not like it's not how it's used in IPv6. In IPv6, multicast is used constantly. And so you really, really need to know your multicast. As I say, we'll go over that. I'm just introducing that. We'll go over that in, you know, as I say, in fairly large detail, so you really understand it. So again, let's talk about the importance of that prefix. If you know that prefix and you know what it stands for, and as I said, if you just learn these 4 things, pretty much, you will have an awful good idea of what kind of address you've got. So, for example, if you've got this FE80, you've got there's no probably about it, you've got a link local address. If you've got something that starts with an FF, something like that, you've got some flavor of a multicast address. If you've got something like this, it starts with a number and so forth, you've got a global unicast. Now, you know, this particular thing, you know, maybe our children's children might have something different in this, but for us, I think we're pretty good. You know, for us, pragmatically, in our limited lifespan, if we have this as the global unicast, I think we can feel safe. You might have something that starts with a 0. Remember I was telling you those funny addresses that shrunk down to : : 1 and : : Those are special addresses, and we'll talk about those and what makes them special and what they're used for. Once you know what kind of address it is, you also know what you can do with it. Can you go out on the internet with it? What's the scope within which you can talk? What devices can you talk to? And sometimes even what can you say? And is it a special kind of address? Now, we know special addresses, you know, I mean, but we don't think about them that way. What's IPv6, what IPv4 loopback? Everybody knows that, right? 127.0.0.1. So there's special addresses for special functions. It's the same for IPv6. And we'll talk about what those are, what some of the special functions. One of the big changes that has happened in addressing, you notice that I talked a whole lot about unicast, I talked about multicast. What I did not talk about is broadcast. We do not have broadcast in IPv6. So you know, it's like that, you know, it's like one of those things, you know, rolls right off my tongue, right? When I say no broadcast. What that means is that it changes how we address our network. Because what are we used to doing when we allocate addresses? What we do is we say, you know, the first one is our network address, and then we've got our you know, our broadcast address in a subnet, and then you might be giving somebody the gateway address. We'll go over all this in the addressing plan area. There's certain specific addresses at the front and back of each subnet in IPv4 that we're used to using. And one of those is the broadcast address, the 255.255 address. There is no such thing in IPv6. So what that really means is the way you think about address planning is different. And as I say, don't worry, not to worry. We have a whole tutorial on that. So you've got to rethink how you do it. And in some ways, it's better because you're not losing 3 addresses per subnet. Because, you know, before, what do we have? 0 is network, 1 is gateway, 255 is broadcast. And in fact, if you do variable length subnet masking, you might be losing a whole bunch of IPv4 addresses. So anyway, it's different. You have to think differently. So we've talked a little bit about unicast addressing. So let's drill down a little more into that, and we'll also drill down a little more into multicast. So we've got some unicast addressing. Remember we were talking about that whole thing, that global unicast address where we had the 48 bits for your San Francisco, 16 bits for your research or janitorial department, and then the 64 bits for the host within that. If you've got this global unicast address, then already you're like, yep, I know that can go out over the internet. I know I can do that. And then we've got our link local. Remember, those are our FE80 addresses. We'll talk about those in a minute. And so this is the allocation for the global unicast addresses. It's by and large, we're going to do it per, let's say, per router interface. And the reason I'm saying it is like we can do 2,000 pretty much, is the current global unicast address allocation is coming out of this range, /3. Oh my goodness, that is a heck of an allocation, right? But who's going to have something like that? Well, IANA has that, and it's going to give the registries portions. And you know, if we run out of that, but again, that who knows when that'll be, but our children's children may be working with some other allocation, but we're going to be good with this. Yeah, in IPv4, we had global unicast addresses too, and they just like IPv6. Then that's how we use them. We go use them to connect from one place to the other. The only difference now is we can have multiple global unicast addresses per interface. Also, too, there are a lot. The IPv6 addresses are 4 times as big, so you want to plan your network so you don't create a big old mess in your routing table. So you have to think about that. Or of course your ACLs. You know, you want to make sure that you're doing things properly, so you don't spend a ton of time searching ACL entries. That whole, doing your address plan correctly is a big thing. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at a Windows IP configuration. So you can just do IP config under Windows, and that's just what I did. This is just my network, just my little one of my Windows devices. And you can see I'm doing everything over Wi-Fi. And what are we seeing here? What are we seeing here? You're seeing that I have me an IPv6 address. No, you know what? I have me 3 IPv6 addresses. Oh my goodness. So I could be using any one of these 3 addresses to go out over this Wi-Fi interface. And you see this though. This is called a temporary address. We'll talk about that as well. But notice that everything here is this one prefix. I've got 2601/642/C201:BD. That is my prefix for my house. So I did this at home. This is the prefix, the /64 that I have coming into my house. Notice this too. So what is this? That starts with an FE80. That is the link local address for this Wi-Fi interface. And of course, we only have the one. We only have the one link local address. Link local address aren't like global unicast. You can't have multiple of those. Here's my little IPv4 address. I'm doing dual stacking, so I've got both. Here's my link local address. Here's my link local address for the default gateway. And then that is going to correspond to my IPv4 gateway address. Yeah. So, I think it's like, once you start getting familiar with these things, it makes them, it starts becoming much more familiar. I'm going to point out one more thing to you. Notice in this address, you see this FCED F57611F7 and so on. You know what? I see that repeated in this linked local address. That's curious, isn't it? That is curious. We'll talk about that more in a moment, about that how that particular address was created and its relationship to the linked local address. But I hope I'm kind of making the point that if you really understand the addresses, then you can know an awful lot. You can know an awful lot about what you have and what it's doing. Again, it's that pay attention to that network prefix. The subnet prefix then, that becomes really interesting. If I were a site and I want to address all my, I want to get all my router interfaces correct, then I'm going to have to do some subnet planning, and we're going to have to figure out how do you give addresses to your subnet. That becomes a really interesting question about what is your philosophy for doing that. You notice within all this, I have been talking about subnet addressing, and even on your LAN, of subnet addressing with your global unicast prefix. How do we do it a lot of times today? A lot of times today, what we do is we do LAN addressing with a private address, with a 192.168 or 10 dot address, something like that. Now, what has happened to all those? We'll talk about that in a minute. Talk about that in a sec. Yeah, because we're going to start thinking differently in IPv6. One of the big questions, one of the big controversies right now is what do you do with this last 64 bits? That's known as the interface ID, and that's per host. The convention that is widely accepted by quite a few people right now is that should be 64 bits, and you should not creep over into that. But I will say, this is a controversy at the IETF, and some people don't agree with that. Most people do agree with it, though. You should follow the controversy and have your own opinions on that. The reasons that people give for reserving 64 bits for the interface ID is because stateless auto-configuration. Stateless auto-configuration is a way of automatically addressing your devices. Stateless auto-configuration is going to want these last 64 bits. So if you ever want to do that on your network, say you want to address a whole bunch of IoT devices, probably you don't want to go ahead and address them by yourself. You probably want to let them do plug and play, essentially. Then if you wander over into this area, you're gonna make it tough. Again, this is an intro. I'm just giving you an intro into the controversies that happen or that are ongoing, frankly, on this. So let's talk about that. Remember, I was talking about that the link local address that I showed you, and then the other address, the global unicast, that appeared to have that whole interface ID being the same. Well, what some people do, or this is what was done in the past, actually, I guess that's a better way to say it. What was done in the past is that your NIC, your Ethernet, whatever it is, your Ethernet, NIC, Wi-Fi, whatever, your interface card is going to have a physical address, say a MAC address, something like that. And so what people used to do is when the stateless auto-configuration took place, they would grab parts of that physical address and create a linked local IP address out of it, and also a global unicast IP address out of it. And that's why, so essentially your MAC address was embedded in your IP address. Other people felt that this was a huge security and privacy violation. And so usually you have a way to disable that, and some of the newer devices don't even do it at all. So the private addressing that you have, you can do that either for, well, okay, let me put it this way. That's a whole thing called privacy addressing, which we'll discuss in another session. Let me go back to one thing, so I'll show you. Yeah, you see this. If you see something that's called a temporary IPv6 address, that is the way that people do not embed that link local, that MAC address in it. You can also assign it by DHCP, and then that would be another way to not embed that MAC address. But let's talk about private addressing. It's like, this is, once you get started, there's really a whole lot to talk about in this whole area. So private addressing, they can either be scoped to the link or scoped to the site, but they're never routed outside that company or link. Remember, in IPv4, say you have a 192.168 or 10 dot address. That is a site local. That's not routed outside your site, but you can have multiple subnets and so forth. The link local, the FE80 address, that is just within that one segment, within that one LAN segment. You can't go outside your router with that at all. So the site local, you can go outside with that. And we're going to hold on for a minute about site local in IPv6, but link local, we've talked about that a fair amount. An interfaces will always have one link local address, period, end of story. They're always going to, if you have IPv6 enabled, it's going to have a link local address. And what you use it for is you communicate with people who are on link with you, my neighbors, whoever is on the LAN with me. There's a ton of communication that is done on link. Neighbor discovery, router discovery, there's a ton of stuff. We'll talk about that more when we talk about stateless autoconfiguration. And a router must not forward link local packets outside. So why do you need it? Well, that's what we're talking about again, is stateless autoconfiguration. Essentially, it's plug and play. You go from not having any address at all for the interface to having, at a minimum, a link local. So your IPv6 stack on your device is going to do that for you. And if you just see a link local and you don't see a global unicast, well, then that's because you don't have IPv6 connectivity outbound. Yeah, we'll talk a whole lot about stateless autoconfiguration in one of the upcoming sessions about neighbor discovery. But site local, now this is another controversy at the IETF. I suppose it's a controversy more for enterprises. Anyway, so we're used to doing site local private addressing, right? A 10 dot address, 192.168. And a lot of us use site local addresses at NAT for hiding the topology. Well, there is no such thing in IPv6. There is no site local unicast addressing in IPv6. There's site scope multicast, but I tell you, there's two things that freak people out, really. That is a technical term about IPv6 when they really start getting to understand it. One is like, I've got the no broadcast. So, okay, I have that under control. I've got to, redo how I do addressing, but no site local unicast. What am I going to do? Like everybody, I have 192.168 everywhere. What is one to do? So what people are doing is they use this thing called EULA addresses. It's the unique local unicast address. it's an F Charlie 00. But hey, look at this. It's a /7 prefix. That is a hunkin' big prefix. You know, you can get a whole lot of addresses. So if you want, you can use EULA addresses inside your network. If you want to, how do I say it? It's like if you want it, it's kind of IPv4 thinking in IPv6 terms. If you want to think, I want to have, for certain purposes, I want to have addresses on my network that are not routable on the internet, I may wish to use EULAs. And we could probably spend an entire session talking about EULAs, and I think we probably should, but not this year. Next year we can talk a whole lot about EULAs and what they might be good for. Again, this is something which is talked about quite a bit at the IETF. What I encourage you to do is go ahead and sign up for the V6 Ops email list. It's the IPv6 operations email list at the IETF, and you'll start hearing some of the controversies. So of course, here we go. This is being used DeFacto site local unicast. It's a huge address space. The problem, of course, is that if, say, you merge with somebody else, if you're big bank number 1 and you buy little bitty bank number 2, and you're both using F Charlie addresses, you could have a conflict. I mean, today, of course, how do we handle that? We handle that with NAT, but there's no NAT in IPv6. Yeah, that's another thing we can talk about. Is there NAT? Is there not NAT? I mean, what is NAT 64 really? We'll talk about that in transition technology. But suffice it to say, you could get into conflict on that. Well, let me start. We're getting near the close. Let me start wrapping this down. So reserved addresses. There's a bunch of things that are reserved. So those weird looking addresses we talked about. They're going to start with a 0 because you see right here, there's nothing in the front of it. It's the unspecified address. That's what you have before you have anything. Before you've booted, before you've got your link local, you have no address whatsoever. Your loopback, ::1 is your loopback address for IPv6. We used to have a whole lot more of this IPv4 embedded addresses. I hardly see that anymore. This you'll see all the time, the IPv6 unspecified address. It basically, you'll have a ::, address, and then after stateless auto configuration, at a minimum, you'll have your link local address. But we had this way back in the early days on IPv4. So what am I showing you here? I'm showing you, this is what, from 2006. I keep my packets. So you've noticed the source address is the all zeros packet. What is this? This is a DHCP boot P request. So we used to have those in the past. Here is stateless auto configuration at work, and we'll spend a bunch of time going over what is stateless auto configuration. That's the plug and play that I was telling you about, how you get your addressing. And you'll see here right here, what is the source address? And the source address here is, let me highlight that for you. Source address here is the : address. That is the unknown address. And so that is your first clue that you are in the process of stateless auto configuration on this device. So loopback, of course, I didn't need to tell you what loopback is. Loopback is, IPv6 loopback is just like v4 loopback. It's not a physical interface. You can't go outside your nodes with it. You can write to it if you're doing a socket application that just stays inside that one thing. Yeah, you can write it to, you can listen on loopback and write to it. Just works just like IPv4 loopback. This, I used to see IPv4 embedded address, IPv4 map. I don't know, I don't even recall if I've seen this even on IBM mainframe applications. I haven't looked lately. But you used to see something like this on mainframe, IBM mainframe applications. So I'll have to look and see what there is now. Multicast. Multicast is used all the time. So let's talk a bit about multicast. It's like a newsletter subscription. What you do is you say, I want to get the New York Times or whatever, USA Today, whatever. And so you register yourself with a multicast group. IPv4 multicast, you've got your class D range. You know, that's what we use in IPv4. IPv6, it's going to start with an FF. You can be a member of multiple groups. Like, for example, I mean, I'm the member of the all women multicast group. I'm also, you know, all women with black hair and all women who live in California. You know, I mean, you're a member of multicast groups. And the same with a device. So you can be, you have a different scope to it. FF01 is a member of everybody who's on the same interface. Well, probably just me. FF02, everybody who's on the same link. FF05, everybody who's on the same site. And FFOE, everybody who's on the internet. Now that's an interesting one. Anyway, that always kind of gives me a chuckle. Like, really, this is a multicast group that we're gonna deal with. Anyway, multicast addresses are registered with IANA, and you can go up there and see. When you start configuring routers and stuff, we'll start seeing, like, you know, it's fun because all of a sudden you see, it's like you get your stuff done right, and you're like, you know, boom, you can see people registering, on to various multicast groups, and then you're like, okay, I guess I've done this right. So if you do FF02:1, all nodes, all routers, or all OSPF routers, and so on. What we'll do next week is we'll go ahead and start pinging some of these things, and you'll see what happens when we ping, like FF02:1 and so on. So address summary, as I say, I mean, if you really get this thing under your belt, it will help you just tremendously. Because once you understand this, then a lot of the other things we talk about will be much more simple. Just learn your prefixes, and get a hold of that, and then you know, things will flow much better for you. The next class next week, we're going to do a hands-on lab. It'll be, again, we'll stick to basics. We'll just look at addressing. We'll look at addressing all over the place. You know, you're like, I'm sick of addressing. But you really, really need to be very familiar with addressing to the point where you're like seriously sick of it. You know, and then we'll move to the next topic. So next thing, what I want to do is I'll be sending you this recording and the foils too. But please help us. We want to do a survey on the most important topics that we can work with for our Enterprise Advisory Council. And what topics can we take on that will be of the most help to you, but, you know, help us to help you, basically. If you would do that, that would be wonderful. And we also have some calls for participation, both for universities and for enterprises. Right now, the enterprise one is limited to the ARIN region, and the university one is global. But giving preference to the ARIN and APNIC regions. We're just doing that just because, you know, because our kind sponsors are from these areas. And we would love to get people involved globally and talk to the other registries and other parts of the world. And so, but give us some time. You know, there's, you know, we're a completely volunteer-run organization. And so it takes us a while, but things are going very, very well in this area. So do help us. If you have any questions, you can contact us. Let me go over to the questions real quick and see what I can take on. Let me see if I can take on a couple of things. That I hope now the question on why IPv6 needs a private address has been answered. There's a question. Yeah, so when we move from v4 to v6, the host identifier remains the same. Is that a rule or just an illustration? No, just an illustration. Okay, so there's some other stuff. Yeah, this is an interesting one. With the IoT boom around the horizon, it seems IPv6 is inevitable. So why not just switch to an ASAP? Yes, I agree. Let's go. Not teasing. It's you know what, I tell you, I understand there's a lot of people need to get on board, a lot of training. But you know, as I say, let's work together. Let's help each other. Because I think he's right. I mean, it's like we're going to have to go at some point. There's a question: is there an IPv6 equivalent for the subnet mask? Thank the Lord, no. No. So there's a question. We don't have an address reserved for broadcast. So how do we give a gateway address in IPv6? Hold on. Let's talk about. Hold on to that thing. It's easy to ask that question. It's not so easy to answer it. So I have a whole session on address planning. Okay, great. People want to know how to sign up for the V6 Ops email list. I will put that in the email. Okay, great. I'll get one other question. What's the difference between a site and a link? A link is just your local LAN, and a site is like your campus building or your hostel or wherever you are. That's your site. It could be, the site could be, it all depends. Like some people may say a site is one building. Some people may say a site is the entire city, but it's multiple links. I guess if you can say at whatever level that is. And then the last one, will a new calendar invite be sent out for each session? Sure, we can do that. Let me talk to one of the other guys. We have that a couple of times. We'll certainly go ahead and send you a reminder. There were some issues with the GoToWebinar calendar and so on. We think we may have figured that out. And so we'll do that. So yes, please take a look at the rest of the things. If you have questions that I didn't get to answer, then let me know. There's so much to do. A lot of security and routing policies need to be evaluated for V6 migration. You bet. That was another question. Yeah, you bet. And that's why let's do it together. That is absolutely the case. So yeah, any ideas or anything else you have, that will be great. Otherwise, let me stop recording now.